Welcome, everyone. I'm Jane Routhwaite, President and Managing Partner of the Osborne Group. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm going to take a minute to introduce session 3 of our new webinar series, The Fundamentals of a Sustainable Nonprofit. In this series, we're addressing 5 key challenge areas facing nonprofit leaders in light of the pandemic. Today's session on operations will focus on exploring the realities of managing and sustaining your organization during the worst of the pandemic, while looking to the future and the potential for new ways to operate as you plan for the post-pandemic world. Our speaker today is Margaret Bodden. Margaret is an energetic leader with global experience and proven success working in the nonprofit sector. Recognized as a multi-skilled leader, Margaret specializes in developing and implementing strategic and operating plans that lead to improved service delivery and better organizational outcomes. I'm going to pass it to Margie now to tell us more about nonprofit operations.
Thank you for that introduction, Jane. And thanks to everyone for joining this webinar on not-for-profit operations. So when I think about operations in the not-for-profit sector, I take a broad perspective on the definition. When delivering a service such as a client consultation, everything that happens up to the point of actually delivering the service is part of operations. So what you're seeing now is a high-level view of operational activities that could be part of your organization. It's not intended to define what must comprise your organization. You may have other activities that are critical to your operations that aren't reflected here. If any one of these elements isn't able to fulfill expectations, or any of the other elements in your organization, what will be the impact on your organization's ability to deliver service? When things are fully stopped, the impact is quite clear. However, when any one of these activities is partially compromised, what would be the impact on your business? What happens when several of these activities are compromised? What's the cumulative business impact? I like to think of operations in the not-for-profit sector as the human supply chain that delivers service. Just as manufacturing companies worry about the impact of a late delivery of a material for the production line, not-for-profits need to consider the impact to their service delivery capability of a late or insufficient delivery of an element of their operations. The pandemic has created a lot of new uncertainties for not-for-profits. Managing day-to-day operations is not what it was, and we can't be sure how long we'll be subject to varying public health guidelines. New operating challenges, such as supply and cost of PPE, have been added to already stretched resources. It's amazing how fast we were able to transition to work from home, but that has added challenges to IT, including ensuring data security. Planning for the return to normal is challenging. We don't know what will be permitted or when it will be allowed. And most importantly, we have limited ability to predict how staff and stakeholders will respond to modified operations and service offerings. Staff recruitment and retention has changed during the pandemic as staff were limited to working at a single organization. Will that continue, or will we go back to the former ways of managing and scheduling staff? No doubt your revenue forecast has changed too. Your organization may be anticipating smaller fundraising revenues or concerns that clients aren't able to afford service delivery fees. So it might be tempting to pull the covers over your head at this point, but we all know this is when your leadership is most needed. So during the pandemic, a Winston Churchill quote, "Never waste a good crisis," has become a popular slogan for encouraging organizations to turn the challenges we're facing into opportunities. Other similar phrases I've heard is out of adversity comes opportunity. And we hear politicians around the world, not just in Canada, encouraging us to build back better. Whichever way you look at it, pandemic challenges are forcing organizations to look at their operations to adapt to new ways of operating improve efficiency, and reduce costs? Will your organization build or bounce back? Can you avoid sliding back into old habits? Can your operations emerge from the pandemic as a more resilient and sustainable organization? So let's have a look at some of the building blocks to achieving a sustainable organization. They won't surprise you, but it doesn't mean that they are easy to deliver. To start, this is a good time, maybe a great time, to simplify and streamline. Your organization has probably been doing a lot of this over the last year out of necessity. Consider making those changes permanent. Eliminate the infrastructure or reporting that would cause organizations to revert. While staff have the momentum for simplifying, could you engage them in activities to identify more ways to simplify and streamline? This is a good time to identify non-value add work and find ways of eliminating it forever. This frees people up to focus on more value add work or take on new higher value activities. When staff are engaged, they are more likely to accept the outcomes and support the transition. Bigger systemic changes can require financial investment, which may require business case and board approval. Don't let the need for big transformation prevent you from capturing smaller efficiencies now. In addition to the benefits of simplification and streamlining, you'll be starting your staff on the journey to becoming a sustainable organization. Consistent, predictable performance is essential to all organizations. Another name for this would be a high reliability organization. This is the idea that your frontline service providers can't be at their best if they're always looking back over their shoulder, wondering if the things they need to deliver the service will be there when they are needed. Predictability in the supply delivery chain will create predictability throughout the delivery chain, and ultimately at the end delivery point where it is needed most. This is a good time when people are feeling open to adapting and being more flexible to create that stable, predictable operating environment. So let's think about risk management. This is a critical skill for all organizations. Too often, risks are dealt with in response to an event that has already occurred. Sustainable organizations will be ready to handle all but the most unusual events by proactively considering their risk profile and how any of those events could impact the organization. And if they did, how would the organization respond? Creating and regularly reviewing the risk register will position your organization to be resilient and agile in response to challenges. The Osborne Group is hearing from clients who are trying to figure out how to manage the risks of 150 remote work locations, when a year ago they only had 2 remote work locations. I'm grateful the big telco outage a few weeks ago didn't affect me personally, but many companies were severely compromised. No phone, no internet. When you're delivering service to people who depend on you for their well-being, you need a plan to manage these risks. Suppliers and other third parties whom your organization depends on need to support your plans to become sustainable. You could buy support by agreeing to pay premium prices for priority access, or hold more inventory of key goods to avoid uncertainties about availability. But that's not the goal. Work with your suppliers to bring them on board and see what they have to offer to improve your operational performance. It's hard for them to turn down a request from an organization that's taking steps to sustain itself for the long run. Sustainable organizations will be in a strong position to deliver against their strategic goals. Some organizations had to put strategic planning on hold during the pandemic, but now's the time to pull those plans back out, update them if they need it, and get back on track. With effective, efficient, and reliable operations in place, your organization will be better positioned than ever to achieve its strategic goals. So when you're thinking about operations, there are 2 types of information to consider. It's tempting to focus only on quantitative, numerically based information, But with that approach, you'd be missing out on the insight to what's driving actions and where the data doesn't tell the full story. The qualitative information, the organizational stories, provide insight to the building blocks of a sustainable organization. Quantitative and qualitative information together give insight that is always worth more than the sum of the parts. This is where we learn about the actions people are taking to mitigate risk, manage suppliers, or to improve predictability. The challenge comes when these actions are in response to a problem that no longer exists or are taken independently, with many people implementing their own risk management systems, all well-intentioned, but cumulatively inefficient and potentially costly. So what is insight? In this context, insight is the combination of numerical data and what's actually happening in practice. Quantitative numbers can tell you there is a savings potential, and qualitative information will tell you how to realize them, and vice versa. A few years ago, I worked with a client who was getting good pricing on their general supplies, things like cleaning products, office supplies, printer ink. No problem there, it would seem. But when we asked about the work processes, it became clear that the person responsible for purchasing general supplies was spending a good portion of their day flipping through virtual and physical flyers, looking for the best prices at local stores. Then someone would be dispatched to make the purchases. These transactions usually involved collecting petty cash from the accounting department or sometimes an expense report submission for approval and reimbursement. You've probably figured out that squeezing the nickel for savings generated more organizational process costs than the savings themselves. Now add to that the person overseeing the purchase of petty supplies was also the person who did first-line IT support. All IT problems had to go through this same person before they could be referred to external support. It was not unusual for staff to wait for IT support, which is usually, when they need IT support, that's usually indicative of a critical problem preventing them from doing their work. So while all this was going on, and people were waiting for IT support, that nickel squeezing operation was whirring away in high gear. So we quickly identified when you put those two things together, the savings didn't look like there was a savings opportunity. It looked like the price was right, but the process demanded a different approach to getting good pricing on your small supplies. So let's talk a bit about what quantitative data is. These are the hard numbers that form the basis of reports and key performance indicators. A lot can be learned by looking for trends, alignment between reports such as cash flow report and inventory, and comparing to benchmarks. When looking at data, there's more to it than the bottom line. You can look at trends over time, comparing volume of spend or instances of service delivery, and frequency of events occurring. Is your organization set up for a regular stream of events, but in fact, events occur in an unpredictable or lumpy way? Do events align from one report to the next? Does the cash flow report align with the inventory report? What's the lag between receiving goods and paying for goods? Perhaps bills are being paid too soon with a negative effect on cash flow. In some organizations, only the financial reports exist. Performance and delivery reports aren't prepared or aren't widely distributed. This would be the equivalent of a manufacturing company having a production report, but not a sales report. That would leave people in the dark, not knowing if they were producing the right products in the correct quantities at the appropriate time. That's frustrating and certainly inefficient. Having a clear picture of what you're producing, whether it's a good or a service, and how well it meets the customer or client's needs is an important operational metric. The other key input is the qualitative information. Qualitative information comes from gathering stakeholder perspective. Stakeholders can be clients, employees, volunteers, board members, community members. They're all invaluable. And perspective can come in many ways. It can be individual conversations, focus groups, surveys. Maybe it's a letter somebody wrote. It's all good. This is where we uncover the unknown steps in operations, the redundancies, the workarounds, the inconsistencies. Sometimes these steps are part of the organizational history or reflect a mandate that was put in place years earlier to address a specific circumstance that no longer exists. Updates to the operating policies and processes are useful at this point to ingrain new processes and policies into the organization. Truly sustainable organizations will have efficient, effective, and resilient operations. Operations are not individual activities. Operations is a series of linked activities that need to work like cogs in a machine to support the frontline service delivery. We're only as strong as our weakest link, and there's no better time to strengthen the linkages in your operations. And now I'd like to hand things over to David McMichael, who's going to moderate our Q&A session.
So I've got one to start off with, Margie. So what are some simple ways to approach cost savings?
Yeah. So cost savings, it's simple. The starting point is to look at what you're spending and how that looks overall. You can do a small, individual savings on any one item, but you really want to look at it holistically so that you avoid that problem that I mentioned before, where somebody's found an inexpensive way to buy one thing, rather than looking at cost savings systemically and saying, okay, what is it we buy and what's the best way? And what this might lead you to is finding preferred suppliers that can deliver a lot of the things that you need instead of going out to individual vendors. Maybe you can, with those preferred suppliers, put contracts in place that will give you a reduction in price every day of the week, rather than just when the flyer says there's a savings on, and if you can get there fast enough. So I'd really encourage you, if you're looking at cost savings, cherry picking will get you a few, but you never, there's other things, as in my example of spending time every day looking at flyers that actually negate all those savings. So I would very much suggest you want to have a look at the whole spend profile and figure out what's the best way overall to save money. And you know what, I'll even be honest, you may have to pay a little bit more for one thing in order to get a bigger savings on something else. So, and that's okay, because that will save your organization money in the end.
David, can I just add something here about cost savings?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So in most not-for-profits that I've been involved with, the majority of the budget spend is on salaries and on people's time. So when we look at cost savings, you really have to look at how people are spending their time. And I think Margie made a point earlier that I think is really important, that certain processes that you may be wedded to, or an organization may be wedded to, they need to be looked at on a regular basis in order to figure out whether they are still useful in terms of achieving the organization's goals. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I worked with a children's mental health agency. In one of their regional offices, they did the binder count every Friday afternoon. So in this agency, they had a binder for every child that was in their care, either residential care or in the community. And every Friday afternoon, a couple of the clerical staff were sent to do the binder check. And when I got involved in this organization, and someone mentioned the binder check and that they did it every Friday afternoon, and it took a couple of hours because there were a lot of binders. And I asked why they were checking the binders. And apparently what had happened was, about 10 years earlier, there had been a crisis one afternoon, and the binder for the particular child that was in crisis was not in the binder cabinets. And so this was implemented, the binder check was implemented in order to make sure that never happened again. But so much had happened in terms of online record keeping, et cetera, that this procedure, which was taking up a couple of hours of two people's time every afternoon, every Friday afternoon, was no longer relevant. So it's processes like that that got started for a particular reason. So in most not-for-profits, if you really want to save money, you really have to look at how your staff are spending their time and eradicating unnecessary work so that you can continue to manage your payroll within your existing resources. And over the long term, that's probably key to at least cost management, cost control, and potentially also cost savings.
How can operations tap into the board perspective in a meaningful way?
Boards generally respond to an organized presentation of operations. They often don't specifically have experience with operations. And I find that, the most straightforward approach is to develop a business case. And that's something that a board will look at with the support of your executive director or your CEO. Operations can have a business case for, what the investment is that's required and what the benefits will be and how it will play out. And sometimes people think, well, business case is just numbers, but going back to my presentation, you can include in a business case the qualitative aspects of what the benefits will be, and you can have the voice of your clients or the voice of your community included in your business case to support the rationale for operational change. It's that's just something the boards more relate to than just the ad hoc idea. If you can put it in a picture and paint that picture of the outcome, you're more likely to pique their interest and gain their support.
And put some data behind it as well. Going back
Mhm.
to, once again, the presentation, the qualitative and quantitative data. How many people are going to benefit from this, both clients and people within the organization, employees who are working in the organization. Is there a dollar impact? A number of years ago, for example, one of our clients, one of our HR principals was working with this client, and she implemented a new approach to a particular business problem that saved the organization $60,000. And numbers do get board members' attention as well.
Yeah, that's for sure. Especially when they're that big. That's great.
How should we train staff in data analysis, or how can we train staff in data analysis so that departments can make their own insights and create efficiencies?
So training in data analysis. Yeah, this is one of those, are you born with it or do you grow it, right? I think the important thing here is, and you don't need to be a mathematical genius to do it. Like, it does help if you've got spreadsheet skills, like that's an important aspect to these things. But, just looking at the reports that you get, and I mentioned this in my presentation, but I feel I didn't emphasize it enough. It's not the bottom line you want to look at. That's almost the last thing you want to look at when you're looking at data analysis. You want to look for the trends. So even if your staff are getting reports, if they can look from 1 month to the next, from the previous quarter to this quarter, look at a year ago, trends over time, that's really your starting point. And from that, people might want to drill down and figure out, okay, so here's an anomaly. I need to understand that better. And maybe that's something that they can figure out on their own, how to look at the information more deeply, or maybe they need some help from often your finance people have those skills. But it really isn't looking about the bottom line. That is the last place that you're going to get that insight. It's in the middle. It's looking at the meat for the trends from month to month, or the differences between months, weeks, quarters. It's really looking for that thing. The summaries and the averages are somewhat helpful, but you really want to look at the trends and the differences. And I don't think you don't need to be a mathematical genius to do that.
We're a small grassroots organization that is in the process of growing and moving from a working board with no staff to a governance board with a small staff. Do you have any tips or tools that might help the board with this change? Suggestions for education to help them understand operations versus governance, maybe?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, and it is a big change to go from a hands-on operating board to a governance board. And that's not unusual for a startup to see that change. Yeah, definitely tools for training for that. In my own experience, having a board work plan is really, really helpful for keeping the board on track. So a board would have an actual work plan with specific activities that the board would undertake at every meeting laid out. And those activities can take up a lot of time. So if you've articulated in your work plan what it is the board is going to do at all their meetings, it tends to help them stay focused, knowing that, they've got a 2-hour meeting and they've got to get through this stuff, and helps bring them back to those board governance issues rather than going into the operations, because they do have that preset work plan that effectively rolls over every year. It's policy review, it's reports from the different parts of the organization. But yeah, the one tool that I would recommend for that, in addition to training, would be having a good, strong board governance oriented work plan.
How often should you do analysis?
How often? Well,
Other than every day?
other than every day. Somebody like me who loves numbers and spreadsheets, I could do it every day and be happy, but that's really not necessary. I would think monthly would be a good starting place. And potentially quarterly, if you haven't been doing it before, monthly, and that will tell you where you need to focus your efforts in gathering data and organizing it. And you may find that some things require weekly monitoring for a little while, so that you can figure out what's going on, and then back it off to monthly. And perhaps once the system is, has worked out the extremes, the highs and the lows, and has become more predictable, you can go to quarterly. But I'd start with monthly. Less than that, you don't really have enough data. And more than that, initially, it's too long. You want to start to make changes, and you may need to adjust how you're collecting the information. And if you wait for quarters, you've lost too much time.
So this person is asking about, training. How can you train your staff to make these business cases?
Well, having a template is a great way to go about it. So it's not difficult to find templates online. So I would start with a template. As Jane has said, numbers are as important as the qualitative aspects. So one of the inputs to a good business case would be the trends. So hopefully, by training your people to do the trend analysis and to look in the middle of the data, not just at the bottom line, you've already created that critical mass of your business case. And then maybe those same people or other people will add the words. Usually having a couple of people contributing to a business case may turn out to be a good thing because you get different perspectives. You might take them longer to write it because they have to come to agreement and consensus, but then at least there's a broader support for whatever it is you're proposing. But business case templates you can find online in many places, and you just write to that, to a structure that you find that makes sense to you. That should get you a long way.
It's good for someone in the organization to feel passionate and strong about the idea or the concept, and having a really good articulation of what you would be trying to accomplish and the cost benefit. I mean, the cost benefit are the numbers, but just the stories that would support the implementation, the development implementation of that innovation or initiative is a very important part of getting people on board with a business case as well. So whatever template you pick, you should have a chunk of it that's focused on sort of the concept or the idea, the description of what it is you're trying to accomplish, and someone who can articulate that very clearly and passionately for the board of directors or for key stakeholders, or whomever needs to be sold on this idea. Sometimes it's not always the board. The board's keen, and it's customers or clients that need to be sold on it. I know that in one organization I worked on, when we were at the point where we were trying to introduce computers into counseling sessions so that the workers could take their notes on their computers rather than handwritten notes, which then had to be transcribed. It was the clients that really needed to be persuaded that they weren't going to lose anything with a computer in the room. Of course, changing the habits of the social workers, especially the ones who've been around for a long time, was also very challenging. But it was really the clients who had to feel comfortable with the fact there was going to be a computer in the room.
Yeah, and Jane, that's a really good point about having somebody who's passionate about the particular recommendation in a business case, able to present it. I was working with a client. I had a business case. I was lined up to do a big presentation. I probably had 20 slides ready to go, and I was sitting in the room outside waiting to be brought in. And it was late. I'd been waiting an hour past the time. And finally, somebody came out and said, "You're on in 20 minutes and you get 3 slides." And so I had to pick 3 slides from the deck to make the presentation, and I had to have that all ready in 20 minutes. And there was no going back to redo the slides at that point. You had to pull from what you had. And that was probably the most successful or one of the most successful business cases I've ever presented, because they pared me down to just what was essential to get the message across. And so when you're presenting to a board, start there. Start with, what are the most compelling elements of this business case, and that's not only what we're going to do, but why we're going to do it and what the benefits will be. And then you can go past that, but you want to get that hook, and having somebody who's really interested and passionate about the project doing that presentation will probably help in figuring out what that message is and getting it across to your board.